Would like to welcome you here this evening to City Hall here in downtown Nashua. Many of you have probably been in this City Hall before, and for those who haven't, I do want to welcome you here this evening. My name is Chris Williams. As Dennis said, I serve as the President and CEO of the Greater Nashua Chamber of Commerce here within the Southern New Hampshire region. And it's my privilege to be with you here this evening to moderate tonight's forum with the 4 GOP candidates for the U.S. Senate seat. Before we get started, I do want to make just a few announcements and kind of lay the ground rules so everyone knows what to expect. First, we'll play a little bit of movie theater here. Please turn off all cell phones, or at least turn them to vibrate so that there aren't any disturbances here as the candidates are giving their remarks through the course of the evening. I also ask that all applause be held until the very end of the program. We ask that in the interest of getting through as many questions as possible. And the less amount of applause there is, the more questions we can get through. So please do hold your applause. If you're a fan of one candidate in particular, please hold all that till the end, and we'll certainly have an ample opportunity to applaud everyone at the end of the program. Finally, the layout of the program. Each candidate is going to have 2 minutes for an opening statement. After all 4 candidates have given their opening statements, we will then dive right into the question and answer session. All questions will be directed by our 2 panelists sitting here at the table in front of the stage and by myself. There were questions that were submitted prior to tonight from the general public and the audience. So some of you may have a question posed to the candidates that you turned in, and we thank you for doing that. I say all that to also remind you that there will not be direct questions asked from the audience this evening, so please do not anticipate being able to raise a hand and ask a question or make a comment at any time during the program. As we get into the Q&A session, the first candidate to answer a question will have 2 minutes to answer that question. Every other candidate will have 1 minute to answer the same question. That way, every candidate gets to answer every question. There are 4 goals that we're here tonight to accomplish. 1 is to start on time. And Dennis, thank you. We were able to do that. Number 2 is allow you an opportunity to learn more about the candidates. Number 3, hopefully we'll have a good time doing it. And then finally, number 4, we're going to get you out of here by 8:30 so that you can get home for the Celtics game at 9. Yes. I'd like to introduce our 2 panelists at this time. Many of you may know them, however, some of you may not. So in the interest of making sure everyone knows who is in the room at the front of the stage, I will first introduce Charlie Arlinghouse. Charlie, since 2003, has served as the president of the Josiah Bartlett Center, a nonpartisan free market think tank. He writes a weekly column on public policy for the New Hampshire Union Leader. His policy research covers a broad range of state policy, including healthcare, prescription drugs, tax and budget policy, and education funding. He has been interviewed on public policy issues on the major domestic networks, in the 25 largest newspapers across the country, and for media outlets on just about every continent. He has degrees in American history from the College of William and Mary and the University of New Hampshire. Charlie, welcome to Nashua tonight.
Thank you.
Secondly, Miss Carolyn Choate. Many of us know Carolyn as a local face here. Carolyn has been in the television industry since 1983. She moved to Nashua in '88 with her husband and business partner, Gordon Jackson, and she has been program manager, executive producer, and sometime host for the last 22 years. WYCN TV 13 is a low-power broadcast station housed on the campus of Rivier College with cable coverage in 25 communities across the greater Nashua area. The station does not endorse any candidate or party, but rather seeks to encourage viewers to participate in the election process and to educate voters about the candidates and the issues germane to Granite Staters. Carolyn, welcome to the program this evening.
Thanks for having me.
There's no need to introduce the 4 candidates because they're going to do that on their own. They have all been briefed on the agenda for the evening. Jim Bender, to the far left here on the stage, and that's only geographically speaking, perhaps not philosophically speaking.
From up here, I'm on the far right.
Jim won the toss and will be the first speaker this evening, giving his 2-minute opening statement. He will then be followed by Bill, sitting on his left, and then Kelly, and then finally Ovide, and then we'll get into the Q&A. Jim Bender, the microphone's all yours for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chris, and also thank you, Charlie and Carolyn, and thanks to the Nashua Chamber of Commerce. I'm Jim Bender. I'd like to introduce my wife, Susan, and my daughter, Lauren. Can you guys stand up for just a second? As you can see, my daughters are fortunate that they take after their mother and not me, fortunately for them. I'm a longtime resident. Our family are longtime residents of Hollis, New Hampshire. We've been here for nearly a quarter of a century. And I'm not a politician. I'm never going to become a career politician. I'm a leader, and I've been a very effective leader throughout my business career, not another lawyer. And I think our Congress is full of lawyers. I'm not sure we need any more. I believe that I can help rebuild trust in government because trust is built on both competence and integrity. And I also believe that we've had a widening gulf in America between the trust of our American people and our government and also American allies in our government. The problems we face as a nation are not nearly as severe as those we've faced in history, and many of them are actually self-inflicted. We have a government that spends too much, wastes too much, taxes too much, borrows too much, and is just way too big. Secondly, we have a government where corruption is spilling out at the seams. It's just been absolutely out of control. Through the healthcare legislation, we saw procedural tricks, budget gimmicks, coercion from the White House, and bribery on a massive scale. And these problems taken together, overspending and corruption, are leading to tremendous economic problems and costing us jobs. I think it'd be nice if we had government leaders who are once again public servants, who could resist a sense of self-entitlement and put the interest of our country ahead of themselves. These are the things that I'm going to bring to Washington if I'm elected to the Senate. Thank you.
Good evening, I'm Bill Binnie. I live in Rye with my wife Nina and our 4 great kids. My office is in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. My dad is here this evening. Maybe you've seen him on a television ad with me when he introduced me a few months ago. I'm the proud son of immigrants. My dad came to America when I was a little boy from Scotland, legally. My dad worked hard. He was a janitor. My mom worked nights. She was a waitress and a housekeeper. I worked my way through college as a mechanic at night, eventually got a couple of degrees from Harvard, a master's and an MBA. After graduate school, I went on to meet my wife, Nina. We've got 4 great kids, and as I said, we've lived in New Hampshire for over 20 years. I think of myself as a son, as a husband, as a dad, and as a business person. After grad school, I started a business in the manufacturing business, making milk bottles, trash bags, and plastic coat hangers. And I built that business into a company with thousands and thousands of employees, over $400 million in sales, almost $500 million. I'm running tonight because of that and my business experience and my business career. You see, my company last summer ran a very simple ad, Help Wanted. We should have had 1 application, 2, 3, 4. We've done that before in Seacoast, New Hampshire. And for 1 simple ad, we got 350 applications. That's why I'm running, because I think our country and our state is headed absolutely in the wrong direction. We're going broke. It's unsustainable. We have friends and neighbors who need jobs. We've spent millions, in fact, billions of dollars in programs that don't work, like into Chrysler, where we put $20 billion and turned around and sold it to an Italian company for $1. We need common sense. We need competence in Washington, now more than ever. And I propose that my life's journey, my background in building businesses, making a payroll, and seeing the capital markets as well as the foreign markets is what gives me the experience to be, as a small business person, the right person now. Thank you very much.
Well, I have a very complicated message tonight. You can't spend money that you don't have. That's a simple concept that I learned growing up right here in Nashua. That's something I hear traveling across our state. That's a principle I learned from 2 very important people who are here tonight. My 94-year-old grandfather, John Sullivan, who's in the front row, who is a World War II veteran. My 92-year-old meme, both members of the greatest generation who taught all of us we can't spend money that we don't have. And as the member of a middle-class small business family, I can tell you that that's a principle that my husband Joe, who's here with us tonight, and I live by. Yet they don't seem to get that in Washington. Well, I have a simple message in 1 word for the Washington politicians. Stop. Let's stop the bailouts. Let's stop the trillion-dollar takeover of our healthcare system. Stop the out-of-control spending that gave us a $13 trillion debt. Stop mortgaging my children and your children's future. And when it comes to protecting our country, stop allowing illegal immigrants to come over our borders. Stop treating terrorists like common criminals. And stop apologizing for the United States of America. My career, my background is one of a prosecutor. I'm not a politician. I had the privilege of serving our state for 5 years as Attorney General and handling some very difficult matters and getting results for people here in New Hampshire. I'm Kelly Ayotte. I'm running for Senate because I believe that Washington must stop.
Thank you, Ms. Ayotte. Mr. Lamontagne, 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chris. I'd like to thank the Nashua Republican City Committee and the panelists this evening and our moderator for this debate. And I also want to thank our fellow candidates who've all filed now. And so you see the field before you that is going to run for the nomination of the Republican Party for this United States Senate seat. My name is Ovide Lamontagne. I'm a fourth generation native here in New Hampshire, the son of New Hampshire farmers, mill workers, and dentists. And if growing up the son of a dentist doesn't build character, growing up with a name like Ovide does, I can tell you that. I've had 20 years of work in the Republican Party as a conservative activist, as a member of the State Board of Education's chairman, as a candidate for office, as a Republican nominee for governor. I've run on a conservative platform before. I know what it means to be a conservative. And I stand on a Republican platform. The question for us as a people is, do we want to continue in the direction we're headed in this country? The wrong direction of deficit spending and large debt, of a government out of control, of people who believe Washington has the answers to our nation's problems and challenges, including nationalizing health care and everything under the sun. The choice for the Republicans in this nominating process is to nominate the candidate who will present the starkest contrast and a real choice for New Hampshire voters this November. And I am that candidate in this race. I'm authentically the conservative candidate. I stand on those values. I will present the sharpest contrast to Paul Hodes, who believes in Obamacare, who believes in nationalizing and coming up with answers from Washington. I believe in the people and the states of this country, and I believe in the people of New Hampshire. And I believe that come November, I'll not only beat Paul Hodes, you and I will go to Washington and reverse course and save our republic in this most of important elections. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lamontagne. We're going to go right into the Q&A session at this time. Before I get into the first question, I would just request a minor technical favor in the back of the room. Whoever's controlling the microphones on stage, if you could make sure Bill Binnie's microphone is working. Thank you. Okay.
Always helpful.
Excellent. Mr. Bender, you get the first question. 2 minutes to respond, and I get to ask you the first question. Being a Chamber of Commerce guy, I'd like to focus on international economics and business for just a minute. Many of us who follow global economics and its impact on our domestic economy are disturbed by what has been happening in Greece the last couple of months. The credit markets finally pulled the plug on the country's national debt, which has sent reverberations across Europe and beyond, but specifically Portugal, Spain, and Italy. Is this crisis just beginning? Is it over? What impacts will it have on the U.S., and what lessons are to be learned from it? And you have 2 minutes to answer all that.
Okay, that's a lot of questions for 2 minutes, but the overall lesson is that just as individuals can't live beyond their means, nor can countries live beyond their means. And every great society, from the Athenian Republic to the British Empire, has seen the decline of their greatest days because of loose fiscal policies. In the case of the United States, we may be able to bail out Greece, we may be able to bail out Portugal and Italy and Spain, but there's going to be nobody big enough to bail out the United States. And we are heading on a very, very dangerous path. In just 6 months, our country went from $12 trillion of debt, on-balance sheet debt, to $13 trillion in just 6 months. And we've more than doubled our debt in the last 10 years. But our debt is just the tip of the iceberg. What we admit to on the balance sheet is just the tip of the iceberg, because We now have total liabilities, unfunded liabilities of over $100 trillion. And in a nation that only takes in $2.2 trillion per year in tax revenue, this is the equivalent of your family having $50,000 of income and $2.5 million worth of debt. It's extremely dangerous. And the policies are dangerous for a variety of reasons, from inflation to devaluation of your currency. And particularly for the elderly, this is insidious, because what we've done here in the United States and what Greece and Portugal and others are going to be doing with their own currency is those who are on fixed income and have retired with a certain set amount of savings, in 10 years' time, our dollar has lost so much value against the euro. This is just not right. You know, somebody who retired in America 10 years ago has in the year 2000, a dollar bought was it 78 cents would buy a euro. It recently hit $1.50. Now, diminishing our savings and the value of our dollar by that much is just not conscionable.
Thank you, Jim Bender. Bill Binnie, you have 1 minute to answer the question.
The failures of Greece can happen here, and if we don't change course, they will happen here. That's at the heart of my candidacy. We are going bankrupt, ladies and gentlemen. Whatever you may think about the health care bill, and let me be clear, I'm against it, I will vote to repeal it. At a time when we spent the health care bill, or passed the health care bill, our country took in $100 billion. Excuse me, they spent $100 billion, and we only took in 100. Got my numbers mixed up, forgive me. We took in $100 billion, and we spent $300 billion in 1 month. We had a $200 billion deficit in 1 month, and it's accelerating. If we don't change course, our country is headed towards an unsustainable debt and deficit situation that will change all of our lives. That's why I'm running, because I believe that my life's experience of making a payroll and fixing and achieving a successful income statement and balance sheet that makes sense, that balances, is at the heart of what they're not doing in Washington. Thank you very much. Out of time.
Thank you, Bill Binnie. Kelly Ayotte, you have 1 minute.
Well, I led this, which is what I think is the fundamental problem, which was demonstrated by Greece, spending money that we don't have. And it really comes down to some simple principles that all of us exercise in our family. I know Joe and I do. Basically, we have to sit around our kitchen table. We have to balance our budget. We've got the bills on one side and live within our means. And Greece did not do that. What they did was grow their government and expand the government and think that that was going to be the solution. And that's where we're headed in this country. We need a balanced budget. That's why I support a balanced budget amendment. We need to rein in wasteful spending, and we need to end the pork barrel earmark projects. There were 8,000 last year. If we continue on that path, we're going to continue to borrow 40 cents on our dollar from countries like China that we don't want to borrow money from. We've got to stop. It is the single biggest threat to our country. It is the absolute reason why I'm running. It's the issue I will wake up every day as a United States Senator on to work on for you and for our children.
Thank you, Kelly Ayotte. Ovide Lamontagne, 1 minute.
Thank you, Chris. I'd like to try to bring the Greece situation back home to the United States and just point out a couple of obvious things. The people of Greece and their government lack the political will to live within their means. And what's worse is when the government started talking about making some cuts in their budgets, they had people in the street protesting. The reason they do is because they have an entitlement mentality there, and that's what's happening to us. 47% of Americans do not pay an income tax. That means 47% of Americans are in the wagon, not pulling the wagon. The leadership in Washington would want a lot more people in the wagon, dependent on government. That's what they want. That's not American. We have the political will right now to do the right thing, to balance our budget by cutting spending. We need to act now with leaders who are willing to do that. Otherwise, we will be like Greece, and we will collapse under our own weight. We are a nation in crisis, and we need to act now, and I'm ready to do that.
Thank you, Ovide Lamontagne. The second question will be posed by Carolyn Choate to Bill Binnie for the first response.
Thank you, Carol.
It's understandable that voters may be confused right now on the issue of government control. as on the one hand, Republicans' common refrain is, get government out of the way of business. Enough already with government regulations and the ever-growing size of government. Yet, in the wake of the British petroleum disaster in the Gulf, and with no end in sight, Republicans, yourselves included, are having a field day lambasting the current administration about government not doing enough to protect the environment there, the Gulf economy, and being lax on regulation oversight. Explain this apparent inconsistency.
Let's be clear. What's going on in the Gulf is a disaster. You want me to use this mic? Thanks. Let's be clear. What's going on in the Gulf is a disaster. It's unconscionable. I'm running for the United States Senate because I think there's a role in government in our lives. But what they're doing now doesn't work. They're incompetent, and we're all suffering. As an example, did President Obama marshal all of the effective forces that he could? Did he commandeer the tankers? Did he commandeer the National Guard? Did he get the best minds together? I don't think so. It took him 50 days to see the victims of that BP disaster. I believe in small government. I also believe that BP, because they've caused this problem, have to pay for this problem. And if they go bankrupt, so be it. I believe that's the lesson of the free market. Now, how it really works in real life, I'll give you a simple example. My office in Portsmouth, New Hampshire is an old building. We wanted to put an elevator in it. We wanted to make it ADA acceptable for disabled people. We went to the local building department and asked to do it. They said we couldn't because it's an old building. So one group saying you have to make your building ADA accessible, and the other part of the government saying you can't. That sort of regulatory mismanagement is what's going on all over America. Our town in Rye, New Hampshire, is one of the most difficult places to build. I just tried to build a small project last year. We had to get 19 permits before we could go to the planning board, and we never made it to the planning board because of the regulatory red tape. I see it every day as a business person. What we need to do is have an efficient, competent government. You know what's going on in the primaries and the local elections in the most recent days speaks to competence. The voter wants somebody to go to Washington to run an efficient, small, capable government. And that's what we need, and that's what I'm about. Thank you.
Binnie. Kelly Ayotte, you have 1 minute to answer the question.
We need effective regulation, not over-regulation. And absolutely, BP needs to be held accountable for any of the shortcomings or cut corners that they made in the drilling expertise here. And we need to make sure that the regulations we have in place are effective. Adding layers doesn't necessarily mean that they're more effective. And we're a small business family, Joe and I. Joe has a landscaping and snow plowing business, and we have repeatedly seen mandates come down from Washington that are passed down to the state that all they do is add paperwork. They don't add more effective public safety regulation. So when it comes to BP, we should find out what happened. We should make sure it doesn't happen again. Make sure that people who are regulating this area are competent. But make no mistake, there are regulations passed down from Washington, and what I hope to do for business is to make sure that the regulation that's in place is effective, that we don't continue to add layers of paperwork for our small business people, because it just makes it harder for them to put people to work.
Thank you, Kelly Ayotte. Over Lamontagne, 1 minute.
Thank you, Chris. Carolyn, that's an excellent question because it brings to light the balance we have to achieve between the role of the federal government and where it's appropriate and the role of the states and the people and where that's appropriate. And the Constitution is what guides us. Where this oil well is located is in waters that are within the jurisdiction of the federal government on the outer shelf. It's an area that the federal government has the responsibility to oversee. And the federal government should be the entity, the governmental entity, ready to respond with a rapid response. The president was AWOL. He should have brought together the captains of industry, the best minds in our government, to deploy a team that would have responded very quickly. In addition, he should have been ready to suspend rules and regulations that have impeded states like Louisiana that want to construct temporary barrier reefs. That's the role of the federal government. But because we define something as a crisis does not give constitutional basis for us to intervene. The reason that we would intervene is because of the jurisdictional basis of these waters and where that's located. And it's a very important question you've asked.
Certainly proven that they don't know how to manage one. President Obama is 18 months into his first leadership position ever, and he should have realized before the end of day one that this was his new number one priority with all this Gulf oil gushing out into the water. He should have called together before the end of the first day all of the great minds, the civil engineering experts, the petroleum engineering experts, the military experts, and said, before tomorrow evening, I want to understand all my options. I want to understand what are the probabilities of success, what are the risks of failure, and he should have had operational plans and contingency plans in place. This disaster has done more harm to both our ecology and our economy in 52 days than probably decades of carbon credits could ever rectify. And the administration squandered the first 6 weeks. They were beating Wall Street executives up. They were resurrecting the don't ask, don't tell. It wasn't until Matt Lauer got him on TV 2 days ago, and we were treated to the presidential profanity and pointing fingers at others. Do you know he has still not had a conversation with the BP CEO? How is that possible? If this was a Republican president, I believe they'd already be talking about impeachment. We need different leaders in Washington. This is just unforgivable what's happened to our ecology and our environment. We have to have better leaders in Washington because that's what government exists for these moments.
Thank you, Jim Bender. The next question will go to Kelly Ayotte. You'll have 2 minutes to respond, and Charlie will be asking the question.
Hi. In September of 2008, John McCain, the GOP nominee, suspended his campaign, and he and his counterpart both issued press statements supporting the first TARP program. The Republican House, the House largely on the basis of Republican votes, initially rejected it, and it was resurrected largely through the efforts of Judd Gregg in the United States Senate. Do you think that the House was right to reject it or Senator Gregg was right to want it? And in Washington, how will you distinguish between good bailouts and bad bailouts?
Well, thank you for the question, Charlie. I have tremendous respect for Senator Gregg, but I disagree with him on the bailout that was done. And I agreed with the House position on that. I don't think that our government should be in a position of picking the winners and the losers in the private sector. And so fundamentally, we shouldn't have picked the winners and the losers on the banks in terms of bailing out the banks. I wouldn't have agreed with bailing out the insurance companies or the auto companies as well. And unfortunately, now there's a discussion about bailing out private pension funds. So fundamentally, I'm against bailouts. I will not support them as a United States Senator. I think that we have to allow the private sector to work itself out, and that sometimes that means that people will fail, but that's what it means to go out and start a business, and you have to have accountability. You should be able to get the incentives for your hard work, and that's why I certainly don't support the tax increases that are coming in January. But also you need to be accountable for your failures, and that's the position I would take as a United States Senator.
Thank you, Kelly. Ovide, 1 minute.
Thank you, Charlie. And thank you, Chris. Clearly, the federal government does not have a role to bail out a private sector industry, group, or company. That's not the role of the federal government. TARP was wrong, as were some of these other bailout initiatives. There is a role, by the way, for government in commerce, and that's to set forth the rules of engagement. That is, the laws that enforce contracts between people. And there's also a role for government when things fail, when companies fail. It's called bankruptcy. And that is the ordinary place where you would go for any company that's having trouble, that needs to reorganize itself. And we've allowed people and entities to escape the consequences of bad decisions, of bad strategies. And in the case of the TARP program, probably the worst thing that happened in the bill was this sort of final clause that gave carte blanche authority to the government to use the money that was appropriated, which is why the President and the Congress now is looking to try to take that money and use it for another purpose, other than reducing the debt, which it should be doing.
Thank you, Ovide. Bill? I'm sorry, Jim? Yeah,
That's
1 minute.
Okay. You know, it may have seemed like the right thing to do at the time, but the long-term consequences of doing it were far greater than the short-term would have been to not have done it. We're built on a society that's founded on capitalism and liberty, and if there are no consequences for failure, then we should get used to seeing lots more failures. People will take unnecessary risks, businesses will take unnecessary risks because they'll say, what the heck? The government's going to bail us out. We do need to have a process of cleansing, and that's what the bankruptcy laws are for. And that's what should have happened, is we should have let the free market system work itself out. Nobody is too big to fail in our country, and it's not like these jobs would have gone away. These businesses would have been restructured, and they would have gone on. So it was wrong to do this. It was a mistake, and I want to make sure, if I'm elected to the Senate, that it doesn't happen again.
Thank you, Jim. Bill, you have 1 minute to answer.
I would not have supported either bailout. It began the slippery slope of where we are today. At the time of the first bailout, we had 7% unemployment. We've spent $1 trillion+ in these various bailouts, and today we have almost 10% unemployment. We have a larger deficit and more debt on our books today than ever before. The people in Washington, simply stated, are incompetent, however well-intentioned Judge Gregg was when he voted for it. I didn't agree with it then, and I don't agree with it now. What we need to do is, I agree with my colleagues up here, let the bankruptcy code work its magic, such as it is and as painful as it is, and restructure these entities so that they do work. We are a successful economy because we move along and the things that are not productive go away and the things that are newly productive emerge. And just as we need a spring and a summer and a fall, we need a winter. And I think that these banks that failed, in some cases, they needed to fail. They were doing the wrong loans, they were engaging in the wrong processes, and they shouldn't do it. So just as BP has a price to pay, the banks had a price to pay, and we should never have engaged in the bailouts.
Thank you very much, Bill. We'll now move to question 3. I'll address the question to Ovide. You'll have 2 minutes to respond. It appears at this point, it's very early, but it appears at this point that Sarah Palin and Mitt Romney will very well be front runners for the 2012 presidential nomination on the Republican side. Which one of these 2 figures do you most closely identify yourself with, both in policy and personality?
Wow, I got the easy question here. Well, first of all, in full disclosure, I was an active and long-term supporter of Mitt Romney's when he ran for president in 2008. I was proud to be with him then, and God, would be a better country if he were president today, especially with the challenges we're facing. Mitt Romney is a man of integrity. He's a family man who is you see on TV is who you meet when you meet him in person. He's genuine. He's authentic. He is sort of a Boy Scout version of a politician. And that's my experience with him. And that's probably because I was past president of the Dane Webster Council, and he was gracious enough to have a fundraiser for the council at his home before he ran for president, and I had the opportunity to meet him. Betty and I met him and his wife, Ann. And I think that's probably what won me over, is the integrity of the man. I'd like to think in a lot of ways that I would try to emulate the person I know as Mitt Romney. Sarah Palin and I have some things in common. She loves snowmobiling, and I'm a snowmobiler. She hunts, and I hunt. Now, I never shot a moose yet. And she's got something else in common. She's the mother of a special needs child. And Betty and I have been foster parents of a special needs child for 21 years. And let me tell you something. I can relate to her, and I support her, wanting to make sure that as Republicans, we continue to fight for a safety net for special needs individuals, because we believe in caring for those who cannot care for themselves and providing the services they deserve. The way we do it is locally, generally speaking. I am a fan of hers for those reasons, and for the reasons I'm a fan of Mitt Romney's. And whoever's the nominee in 2012, I'll gladly support either one of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Ovide. Jim, you have 1 minute to answer the same question.
I liked many of the candidates in the last election, but I think I'd most identify with Mitt Romney because he's a problem solver. He has a history of taking dysfunctional organizations that are in trouble and turning them around. He also, unlike a lot of other politicians that just talk the talk and can memorize a few lines and get through a debate, he actually walks the walk. He's actually able to do it. He's got a track record of having achievements over and over and over again. And that, I believe, is how he should run his next campaign, based on what he's achieved rather than positions. And finally, he's what our country needs. We need greater trust. We have a real gap in trust between the people and the government. And trust comes from competence and integrity. And I believe that Mr. Romney is a man of vast competence and great integrity. And I will be supporting him in the next presidential election.
Thank you, Jim. Bill, you have 1 minute.
You know, I think they both have a great deal to bring to our party, and I see a bit of myself in both. To the extent that Mitt Romney is a successful business person, I see some of that in me. I was the CEO of a New York Stock Exchange company that I built and started at the age of 32. As a matter of fact, when I was leaving graduate school, Mitt's company interviewed me, and I still remember the interview some 30 years later. So I do see that he, as a successful business person, could have helped America tremendously today. But Sarah Palin also brings something that's critical and needed in Washington. And it goes something like this. She's not going to take the standard line. She's not part of the same old gang. She wants to change things. And I respect that. I think we need that as well. We need somebody, to use her own words, that's willing to go rogue, that's willing to not play by the same old rules, and recognizes that what we've been doing for the last 10 or 20 or 30 years is not working right now. And to that extent, she would have been a breath of fresh air. So I see both of myself in both of them. But more importantly, I look forward to a spirited 2012 primary, and I would be willing and look forward to endorsing and supporting the winner of that.
Thank you, Bill. Kelly, you have 1 minute to answer the question.
I can tell you right now that I would rather see either of them be president right this minute. And I will tell you that I certainly respect Mitt Romney. I respect his diligence, his intelligence, and his integrity, and I respect the same with Sarah Palin. And I certainly respect her courage. She was under tremendous attack when she became the first woman to be vice president, serving with Senator McCain as the presidential nominee. And you know what? She withstood it. She stood up. She's got courage and conviction, and I respect that very much. So I would be proud to support either of them as the nominee of our party and wish either of them were president right now.
Thank you very much, Kelly. We'll now move to the next question, which will be answered first by Jim, and the question will be posed by Carolyn.
Immigration. Again, more confusion on party lines. Democrats from the top down saying the Arizona law is misguided, un-American, smacks of Nazism, is based on hatred, and that racial profiling will rule the day. And I might add, few on either side have read the legislation. Republicans, naive to think that racial profiling won't happen, that the only reason Democrats want to defeat the legislation is to stack the votes in their favor, that amnesty would encourage illegal immigration, and that 10th Amendment rights ought to supersede federal law. My question to you, somewhere in the middle lies the truth. What is it?
Thank you, Carolyn. Kelly, you probably aren't old enough to remember this, but Sarah Palin was not the first vice presidential nominee. It was Geraldine Ferrari. Okay. I thought you said the first. I thought I heard her try to say Republican. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Then I apologize. As far as the Arizona law, the first responsibility of the federal government is to protect America and to protect American lives, liberty, and property. Failing that, and we have at the federal level we've failed to do this for decades. It then becomes the state's responsibility to protect their citizens. And Arizona passed a very reasonable law, but what this really highlights is we need to secure our borders firm and tight. And we have to make sure that those who cross into our country illegally are sent home. It's as simple as that. It creates such a cost to our economy at so many different levels, and a country that can't protect its sovereignty is not going to protect its future. So this is something we need to do. The Arizona law is a very reasonable law. I have read this law, and I think it was built to withstand a federal challenge. But I think we've got a broader issue. In so many areas of our country, we're finding our federal government in conflict with the states. Not only do we have a situation in Arizona, but we have a situation in Alabama where some of the politicians there are saying, why should we be providing our driver's license and our driver's test in 14 languages, including Farsi? How can this make sense? How can somebody who doesn't understand English be dependent upon to be able to obey road signs? And the government the federal government is threatening to withhold highway funds. This makes no sense at all. Some of the Gulf states are trying to take measures to protect themselves in the wake of this oil spill, and the federal government is standing in the way of this. This is just not right. You know, our federal government
Jim,
has
that is time.
Oh, I
Thank
beg
you.
your pardon.
Bill, you have 1 minute to answer the question.
I think that Robert Frost, a New Hampshire poet, said it best. Good fences make good neighbors. I think that the Arizona bill highlights a problem, which is a failure of Washington to deal with a very straightforward issue, illegal immigration, people pouring over our borders, and we can't deal with it. Washington, for whatever reason, is unwilling to deal with it. I say it's very simple. I say that we build a secure wall that secures our borders from illegal immigrants and stop this illegal immigration that's going on. Second, I think that we should say that the people who are here in this country, all of us, do one thing: learn to speak English and make it our national language for a whole bunch of reasons. And second, I think we must recognize I am the proud son of immigrants, and I say this in all sincerity. There should be one allegiance to one flag, to one country, this country, America. So I think the answer is some common sense. I think it's to stop the illegal immigrants coming into our country by securing our borders, and to require the people who are here to speak English and to adhere to our laws and our regulations. I'm not for amnesty, and I'm not for the kinds of situations of politicizing of this issue and the failures that are going on in Washington. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Kelly, you have 1 minute.
Unlike our Attorney General of the United States and our Director of Homeland Security, I have read the Arizona bill. And I can tell you it's double-spaced, about 20 pages, single-spaced, about 10 pages. And I approve of it. I agree with it. And I'll tell you, they have a serious public safety issue in Arizona. They are facing a situation where they had a deputy sheriff that was almost murdered, a rancher who was killed on his own property, and then his dog was shot. They have the second highest rate of kidnappings in the world. And we have a fundamental duty when it comes to national security, and that's to keep people safe. And we have a failure of leadership in Washington. We have to secure our borders as a matter of public safety. We have to secure our borders because with people coming over and not illegally, it's also putting a burden on our healthcare system and our education system. We need to enforce our existing immigration laws that aren't being forced right now. And absolutely, English should be the language of our country. But this is an issue where the federal government has to lead. And I'll tell you that if I have the privilege of serving, it will be one of the first issues that I take up after balancing our budget.
Thank you, Kelly. Ovide, 1 minute.
What we're seeing happening in America is a civics lesson that's long overdue. And that civics lesson is this. The national government was formed when the states, the 13 colonies at the time, agreed to delegate certain enumerated powers to the federal government. And contrary to something your question suggested, the Constitution under the 10th Amendment doesn't allow a state to supersede federal law. What the 10th Amendment says is that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. The states have inherent right and responsibility and duties independent of the federal government. And we're reclaiming a states' rights concept in America right now. Now, the federal government has been delegated the responsibility of national security, including border security. Absent its failure to act, the states have the responsibility and duty to act to protect their citizens, and no president or Congress should undermine the state when it does that. Not when the president of Mexico is visiting, that's for sure.
Thank you, Ovide. The next question will be first answered by Bill. You'll have 2 minutes to respond, and Charlie will ask the question.
every state in the nation has a gas tax, and on top of it, the federal government levies an 18.5-cent gas tax as well, which we collect at the state level, send down to them, and then you get to decide, assuming you're elected, how much we get back, and how much New Hampshire deserves and how much Vermont deserves. Republicans for a long time have talked about, although not ever done anything about fiscal federalism. What would be wrong with, say, just giving the gas tax back to the states and letting them have it? And what would you do about devolving other programs from the federal government to remove power from yourself?
Well, the one thing that we should all recognize is that government is really good at one thing: taxing. They can come up with more and more creative ideas for coming up with revenues and taxes than any of us in this room could ever imagine. And the federal tax on gasoline is just one of a whole host of them. Concord, by the way, recently is doing a pretty good job of emulating Washington from what I've seen in the newspapers. I think what we need to do is understand in Washington they've got to stop one thing: these federal mandates that drive cost into states and cost all of us money, number one. Number two, I believe that lower taxes, less regulation, more freedom is at the heart of what makes us Republicans. Number three, I believe in the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, which says that states are sovereign, which means by that definition and my view of small government, that most of the money, and to every extent possible, except for defense among others, that extra money should be returned to the states, or that tax done away with entirely. I think the bottom line and the bigger picture overall, though, is that our tax system is much, much too complicated. Hundreds of forms, 4 or 5 million lines of tax code, plus all of the various fees and hidden costs that we don't even recognize. What we've got to do as American citizens is say, enough. Stop taxing us, cut our spending, and get our act and our balance sheet in order, or else we're going to go bankrupt. So I would be in favor of, first of all, reducing taxes. One of the things that's going to happen at the end of this calendar year is we're going to see things like the capital gains tax go up, income tax go up, the return of the death tax from 0% to 55%. We're going to see a whole host of taxes return, in some cases doubling and tripling. It's a tragedy. It's going to impact our economy. It's going to slow job growth. And if we don't stop the taxing and curtail our spending, we're going to have a very different country in the days ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Kelly, you have 1 minute.
I believe there is a fundamental purpose of the federal government when it comes to a strong transportation infrastructure. However, I can tell you that when it comes to taxes, then in terms of the gas tax, other taxes, there should be local feedback because Washington doesn't have the answers to this. And I think that's part of the problem with what's happening in Washington ultimately. And we need to ask the question with every single bill that comes before you as a United States Senator, is this a role for the federal government or is this a role better left to state and local governments? And that is a question that I will absolutely ask. And when it comes to what they're doing right now in Washington, they have expanded federal control drastically. The prime example of that is this health care bill. This health care bill creates new taxes, mandates on individuals, mandates on small businesses, and tax increases at a time they can't afford it. And if you want a prime example of tax increases that aren't correct, it's that health care bill, because the federal government should not be mandating to individuals and states that they have to have a certain product and that they have to pay taxes for that product and mandates for that product. And I'm going to ask that across
Kelly,
the board with every issue that comes up.
Thank you, Kelly. Ovide, you have 1 minute.
Thank you, Chris. If I understood the question, Charlie, it was about devolving power from Washington to the states, and you used the gas tax as an example of that. I think that's exactly what we need to be doing. I'm the only candidate for United States Senate who's taken the position as an example of devolution that I would abolish the Federal Department of Education, and I would repeal. Sorry, the union was running that, I think. The NEA was back then. I know they're powerful. I've had to deal with them before. And repeal No Child Left Behind and the federal control over elementary and secondary education as an example of restoring the rightful role of the states, local communities, and the people over elementary and secondary education. What have we become when we look to Washington tell us what we should be teaching our children and evaluating that. That is not the role of the federal government. And by the way, I didn't come to this position yesterday or the last few months because I'm running for U.S. Senate. I invite you to look at my record in the mid-1990s when our state, under my leadership, was the only state to say no to Goals 2000 on the principle that the federal government should not have more, but should have less control over what we do in the area of education, and that applies across the board. I'm the candidate for devolution in this race, Charlie.
Thank you, Ovide. Jim, you have 1 minute.
Our economy is spending twice as much, our federal government is spending twice as much money today as it was 10 years ago in the year 2000. And this is strangling both our economy and our jobs market. The byproduct of our government, our federal government, is overtaxation, overregulation, and over-litigation. We want to cut spending at all levels of the federal government. There is no reason in the world why the government should be spending twice as much money as it did 10 years ago while doing the same things. And so rather than take a specific tax and say, would you give this back to the states, I would say we're going to look at hard spending cuts across the board in the federal government and then cut taxes along with that. That's the best thing that we could do to stimulate our economy and also to bring jobs back to New Hampshire. So, yes, my role would be to shrink the size of the federal government, reduce its power, and to adhere to the 10th Amendment of the Constitution.
Thank you, Jim. Kelly, you get the opportunity to answer the next question. You'll have 2 minutes to do so, and I'll ask the question to you. A lot of ruckus has been made of earmarks, federal earmarks for states, and Paul Hodes and, I believe, all 4 candidates here have expressed their desire to see earmarks go away. Yet, there are earmarks that do benefits for the state of New Hampshire as across the rest of the country. The Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center being one example, Nashua's own Broad Street Parkway being another good example of a recipient of federal earmarks. With this, is it really fair to denigrate earmarks, or is this more political grandstanding?
We need to end earmarks. The reason we need to end the earmark process is because last year alone, there were thousands and thousands of earmarks, and many of them led to things like the Bridge to Nowhere. We have earmarks where that process has been used to buy votes. It's been corrupt, where people hold over other senators or representatives. I'll give you this for your district if you give me this vote. And it's a corrupt process. It has to end, and it's been abused. And I think that it's very important that as a United States Senator, that my view is not only to represent you here in New Hampshire, but to make sure that we have a balanced budget, that we're spending your money responsibly across the board. And that's why I signed the Citizens Against Government Waste pledge against earmarks. That's why I do not support them. I think that they have been corrupt. And if there are projects here in New Hampshire that deserve federal funding, they should go through a competitive process like in other states and be included in a balanced, disciplined budget. Because if we don't have a balanced budget, again, we've got a $13 trillion debt. We cannot sustain where we are now. And our number one priority has to be to get our fiscal house in order. And that's why I don't support earmarks, and I would vote to end that process.
Thank you, Kelly. Ovide, you have 1 minute.
Thank you, Chris. The earmark process is a corrupting one. We've seen it over the years where money has been spent for programs that have nothing to do with the national interest or what the role of the national government is, the federal government. The federal government is not a charitable foundation and is worthy of some of the projects that have received federal grants and monies. That is not the role of the federal government. We need to bring some New Hampshire values to the legislative process in Washington. The bills stand on their own and they don't have non-germane amendments. Earmarks are like non-germane amendments to bills. And by the way, did you ever ask yourself the question how the health care bill went from 2,400 to 2,700 pages? It's because they added the nationalization of the student loan program. Nothing to do with the bill. We need fiscal integrity. We need legislative integrity. Paul Hodes has had an election year conversion on earmarks. We got to be ready to send a candidate who can stand up and say, I've been consistently against earmarks, and that's me.
Thank you, Ovide. Jim, you have 1 minute.
Well, I think that if we're actually sending public servants and patriots to Washington, and that if a bill deserves to be passed, then one shouldn't need a bribe in order to vote for it. And if it didn't deserve to be passed, what bribe would make you vote for it? Unfortunately, that's what it's become. The Cornhusker kickback, the Louisiana Purchase. The administration hands these little bribes out to secure a vote on a bill that shouldn't have been passed to begin with. I don't believe that we should have earmarks, period. Anything that requires taxpayer funding should stand on its own 2 feet for a vote rather than be put on as a sidecar to more vital legislation. So the process has gotten out of hand, and finally, our representatives in New Hampshire just aren't good at it. We can't keep up with guys like Robert Byrd. When you look at the people who are really good at earmarks, none of them are from New Hampshire.
Thank you, Jim. Bill, you have 1 minute.
Well, it's unanimous. I, too, am against earmarks. At a time when 40 cents out of every dollar we're spending in Washington is borrowed, why are we doing earmarks? It makes absolutely no sense. I, too, have pledged not to execute or engage in an earmark of any kind. And it's really that simple. It's not hard. It's the difference between right and wrong. So with that, I'm against earmarks.
Thank you, Bill. Ovide, you'll get the next question. You'll have 2 minutes to respond, and Carolyn will pose the question.
Thank you. Just about everyone in liberal circles, those elected, those lobbying, those pontificating, say Obamacare might not be perfect, but Congress had to start somewhere because the American people demanded change for far too long and didn't get it. What, in your mind, is wrong with Obamacare? What will you propose to do about it? And how does your view differ from that of your opponents?
Thank you for the question, Carolyn. I'd like to go back to the BP question and just point this out. The fact that there's a challenge, a crisis, doesn't mean the federal government has a role for it. So if people are concerned about health care in America, the answer isn't going to Washington to try to fix it. It's to go to the level of government that's properly authorized to oversee it to the extent that's appropriate for government. The fact that the federal government would have this bill that would essentially nationalize health care is unconstitutional, particularly with respect to the individual mandate. You all understand this, right? The federal government is requiring us. Who is Washington to tell you or me that I have to buy insurance, or my employees have to have my insurance because I'm an employer, and if I don't do it, I get penalized? That's un-American. There should be much more protesting in the streets. You know, we're still numb from this thing. We don't even know the costs of it, how it's going to work out. It's a bill that needs to be killed in its tracks and repealed. My view would be to recognize, number one, health care is a locally grown, locally administered, and developed system. Why it's not working is because the federal government already, under Medicare and Medicaid rules and regulations, has perverted the system, has removed competition and market forces from this system. I practice in health care. I've learned this the hard way. It's very complex and complicated because the federal government's already involved. What I would do is propose block granting Medicare monies to the state, in the theme of the devolution that you mentioned, Charlie, and let the states use that Medicare money on a formula that's appropriated based on the number of senior citizens who are eligible for it, acuity levels, cost of health care, and let the states design the system with local planners, healthcare insurance providers that works for their citizens. And let's let competition go run state lines, run across state lines so you have advertising on a national level, and then bring some free market forces into the acquisition of services. And lastly, let's incentivize our states to enact meaningful tort reform, which is state law driven, but can be incentivized by the federal government to be undertaken, not mandated again. It's a complicated issue, obviously. 2 minutes is up.
And you packed it in 2 minutes. Thank
you. I tried to.
Jim, you have 1 minute.
Well, contrary to the reports, this bill was not about lowering the cost of health care for all Americans. It doesn't. And it wasn't about extending medical coverage to all Americans. It doesn't. It was really about the federal government gaining greater control over all of your lives and ours from cradle to grave. And that's why nobody bothered to read it. I read it when it was 1,018 pages back in the weekend of October 18th and 19th. And John Conyers of Michigan had just said, no, I didn't read it. Why read it? It would take me 2 weeks' time and 2 lawyers to even understand it. Well, that implicitly says the 2 weeks of my time is worth more than the trillions of dollars of your money that I'm about to spend. But the bill ballooned from there to over 2,000 pages by Christmas, and as it was finally passed, 2,750 pages. Nobody's read it, and I guarantee you, nobody understands how it's going to be implemented. And how can anything that's 2,750 pages make sense? We've run our country since 1789 with this little document, the Constitution. If you put it on 8.5 by 11 paper, it'd be less than 15 pages. What could possibly make sense that's 5.5 reams of paper tall? And yet our Congress these days
Thank you, Jim.
can't...
That's
okay.
time. Bill, you have 1 minute.
I would vote to repeal the current health care bill. There's many things wrong with our health care system. But this particular bill is only going to make it worse, and it won't change affordability in any way, in any substantive way. The tragedy is, as I said earlier, stumbled over my numbers, at a time when health care bill was passed in February, our country only took in $100 billion, and they spent $300 billion, with a $200 billion deficit in one month. This particular bill makes things only worse. You know, when President Obama, here's a sobering statistic and fact, when he came into office to today, 6 out of our 7 largest banks are now government-owned. 2 out of our 3 largest automobile companies are government-owned. Our largest insurance company, now government-owned. And tragically, because of this bill, our healthcare system is now mandated and controlled by Washington. That's at the very heart of what's going on and what's wrong with Washington. They're overreaching, they're overtaxing, and what makes it all worse is they're incompetent. They're absolutely incompetent. No, I believe that the health care bill is wrong in its merits, it's wrong in its size, and it's wrong in its scope. And I think that time will show that it's not only unaffordable, we'll have to amend it and change it dramatically, or else we'll go bankrupt. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Kelly, 1 minute.
We have a significant issue with health care costs, but only in Washington would they pass a bill that makes it worse. The federal government has come out with a report recently, something they should have had in advance of voting on the bill, from CMS that talks about health care increased premiums under this bill. CBO's come out with a report, it adds to our deficit. Well, we already have a $13 trillion debt, and it mandates to individuals and gets involved between us and our physicians in a way that the government should not be. And there's a very bad impact here in New Hampshire on businesses. This morning I met with people who are medical device manufacturers here in our state. We have 55 of those companies here in New Hampshire. Per capita, we have the highest percentage in the United States. And that bill includes drastic tax increases on our medical device companies, and it's going to force many of them to go out of business. So it also is going to put people out of work, unfortunately, that bill. So I would vote to repeal it and replace it with private market reforms, including opening up our insurance markets across state lines, allowing small business people like my husband to pool together to get better rates, and of course tort reform, because our physicians should not have to practice defensive medicine, and we shouldn't always have to be looking over our shoulders, and we could reduce costs by enacting those reforms without adding to our deficit.
Thank you, Kelly. The next question will be posed to Jim. He'll have 2 minutes to respond, and Charlie will ask the question.
In the early 1980s, the deficits had, annual federal deficits had risen to about 7% of GDP, which was considered at that time anyway unsustainable. And we passed a law, thanks to a senator from Nashua, the Gramm-Rudman law. One of the most controversial provisions of that law, it said gradually ratcheting down deficit targets to try to get to zero and balance. One of the most controversial provisions was that it would have a sequester if you didn't meet that law, where there would be automatic cuts. Do you think Senator Rudman was on the right track, or is that a little too severe?
I do think Senator Rudman was on the right track, and no, Charlie, I don't think it's too severe. When you look at where our country was 30 years ago in 1980, we were spending in the low $800 billion, and we were horrified that we'd hit a $65 billion deficit in 1980. Now we're going to spend $3.8 trillion, which is almost 5 times as much money, while doing essentially the same things. And we're looking at a deficit of $1.6 trillion. So this is just not right. It's not sustainable. We have a Congress that seems to just be addicted to spending. They can't do the responsible thing. We need to have provisions for a balanced budget and also for automatic cuts when we go over. Incidentally, our debt, our balance sheet debt as a percentage of GNP is now approaching 100%, which is unbelievable. What's even worse, however, is that our off-balance sheet debt, our unfunded liabilities from Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, is now over $100 trillion. So we are so irresponsible, and this is going to have catastrophic consequences. The other thing is, how do you expect the world to keep lending you money at these low interest rates? You know, we've allowed our dollar to devalue at such a rate over the last 10 years that at one point we had lost 45% of our value when the dollar had hit $1.50 against the euro. Now, if you're going to say, gee, we're going to borrow $13 trillion forever, but over the next 10 years we're going to double that, who would keep lending you money if they know you're going to devalue your currency by 40 or 45%? You're not going to get lent money at the rate of our long bond, which is in the mid-4s. And so we have a situation which is not sustainable. If we don't bring discipline upon ourselves, it will eventually be imposed on us. And when that happens, we're not going to like the consequences.
Thank you, Jim. Bill, you have 1 minute.
You know, the problem in Washington is not revenue, it's spending. What's going on in Washington is completely and absolutely unsustainable, and we're going to go broke. There's no political will in Washington. I'm hopeful that this election cycle coming up in November will take a whole new group of people into Washington that aren't career politicians, that do get it, that have lived in the real world. But let me make a very simple prediction. In a very short period of time, 6 months, 12 months, a year, 2 years, some bond trader in some faraway land like Singapore or London or Frankfurt, maybe even New York, is going to wake up and say, this particular piece of paper issued by the United States government isn't AAA. I'm not buying it. And they're not going to fund us. And when they don't fund us, we'll have some of the real challenges that we're seeing in Greece, because Greece is the future unless we change our ways now. We have less time than we think. That's why I'm running. I'm running because I get it. I'm worried. It is unsustainable, and unless we do something different, and that is very simple, which is cutting our spending and showing that we can, in fact, turn this around, we will have a severe and significant problem, and soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Kelly, you have 1 minute.
I respect what Senator Rudman did, and I do not think that it was too drastic. But I think the fact that that bill had to be passed demonstrates a fundamental problem with Washington. The job of Congress and the United States Senate is actually to balance the budget and to make the hard decisions up front. And you shouldn't need a law to tell you that you have to do that. That should be something that should come from common sense. And I want, in my view, every day to wake up and figure out how we can cut spending, rein in the waste in Washington, and have a balanced budget. And if that means standing forward, making the hard decisions, I'm prepared to do that. And if any of you here think it's going to be easy, we all know it's not going to be easy. So don't vote for anyone who says this is going to be easy. Because I'm going to stand up and make the tough cuts that need to be made, even if it means only serving one term in the United States Senate, because I want to be able to return to all of you and tell you that I did what I said I would do and be accountable to you. And that's been the fundamental problem in Washington, the fact that we need a law to tell everyone what we already know. You need a balanced budget.
Thank you, Kelly. Ovide, you have 1 minute.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Charlie, for the question. I think the reason that there's so many people here is that we all recognize that we are a nation in crisis and we want to do something about it. And the crisis is fiscal, among other things. We need to do what we can to put ourselves immediately on a track to solvency. But we need to focus on spending, and that's what the sequester provision looked at. I disagree with Senator Gregg when he introduced legislation recently in the last year where he wanted to have some sort of a study done about trying to come up to a balanced budget, but looking at spending tax increases along with spending. I think that's not the right approach. We'll have to look at spending cuts. Zero-based budgeting is the approach I would take going into the job. But I also think we need structural infrastructure changes, which is why I support a constitutional amendment for a balanced budget amendment, constitutional amendment for presidential line item veto, term limits, and the types of things that will incentivize and have a system that acts responsibly when the people themselves aren't willing to do it, for whatever the reason. The focus on the spending cuts that the Senator Rudman's bill had is the right approach.
Thank you, Ovide. Bill, you get the next question, and you'll have 2 minutes to respond. And it's a little bit of a curveball. Let's assume that you're not running in this race right now and that you are not filed, you're not going to be on the ticket. Which of the other three candidates on this stage would you support in the primary and why? And you cannot say I'd support all of them.
That's a curveball. I can sit my 2 minutes out if you like. You know, it's not fair to say that everybody up here isn't terrific, because they are. It is very hard to run for the United States Senate. I know I quit my job. I know other people up here have done the same thing. They've put themselves out. Their families are here to support them. God bless them. Trust me when I say that all of the people up here have the best intentions. Trust me when I say I know how hard it is for each one of these people up here to do this. The folks up here, by and large, I agree with. I would take any one of them over just about anybody in the United States Senate, let alone against Paul Hodes. They're good people. I think that we'll be well served to have anybody here, so I respectfully disagree that I have to pick one. I think all of us will be lucky enough to have any of them, and I mean that. And I want to say thank you to each one of them for competing with me, for engaging with me, for adding their voice, for contributing, for volunteering, for stepping up. And because my mic is broken, I'm now going to say in my broken mic who I'll vote for.
Oh, thank you, Bill. Thank you. That's the first thing Bill said today that I completely agree with.
Kelly, you have 1 minute to try and top that.
Ditto.
On mic or off?
On mic and off. How's that?
Is that it?
That's my answer.
Ovide, you have 1 minute to respond.
I can't figure it out. Chris, there's some technical problem here. I'm going to answer it this way. Paul Hodes cannot be the next U.S. Senator from New Hampshire, period, end of story. And I pledge you this, whoever the nominee is, if it's not me, it's going to be me, but if it's not me, I will work 100% behind that person. I know what it's like to run for office, to win the nomination of your party and not have your party behind you. It's not just painful, it's detrimental to the state. I'm not going to let that happen. I'm not going to pick among these candidates because they're all fine people. But I'll be there in November, whether I'm on the ticket or one of them is. And that's the way we should do it. We're at the National Republican City Committee. This is a time for solidarity. And let's never forget that. And let's have fun as conservatives, which I think we can. And we are. Thank you.
Thank you, Ovide. Jim, you have 1 minute.
Well, I think if I could roll the best attributes of Bill, Kelly, and Ovide into one candidate, we'd have one hell of a candidate. There are certain things that I respect about all three and certain things that I like about all three. And I agree that any one of us would be a far better choice for America and for New Hampshire than Mr. Hodes. I also want to say that I've got a much greater appreciation for what it is to decide to run for national office, what you put yourself through, your family through. You risk your fortune, your reputation, you risk all parts of yourself to do this. And you've got to admire the people that decide in all these races to do it. My hat's off to Bill, Kelly, and Ovide because I think they're all fine people, and I think that I admire doing it side by side with them. I admire what you are putting yourselves and your family through, and one way or the other, one of us is going to take on Paul Hodes and beat him.
Thank you very much, Jim. I'm going to turn to our debate organizers for a second. Dennis and Ed, it is 8:17. Do we have time for one last question? Okay. Is that fair to everyone? One last question, and 1 minute for everyone rather than 2 minutes for the first respondent? Okay. With that, then, it looks like we will go to Kelly, and that will be Carolyn posing the question.
Thank you. Distinguish yourselves from Democrats in general and from Paul Hodes specifically on the issue of foreign policy relative to the Middle East, Europe, and or North Korea.
Well, we have an administration right now that is failing to stand by our allies and trying to appease our enemies. I think that we have some fundamental policy differences there. I'm someone who believes that we should stand up with our allies, whether it's in Eastern Europe, whether it is in Israel, and we have significant challenges right now. I do not believe that we should be trying to appease bullies like the leader of Iran who's trying to acquire a nuclear weapon. And a fundamental difference between Paul Hodes and I is I have been outspoken on the treatment of terrorists. And I think that terrorists should be treated as enemies of our country. They should be tried in military tribunals, not in New York City. And I do not support our Attorney General's decisions in that regard. And I also, as a result of what happened on Christmas, firmly believe we cannot return to a pre-9/11 mentality. And as a result of the failures that we saw on that day, when our Director of Homeland Security said everything was fine, everything wasn't fine. That was a failure of leadership. I called her out on it, and Paul Hodes was silent. So there's fundamental differences between us. I will always put public safety and the safety of our country first. And we're a military family. My husband served in the Iraq War. I will make sure that our men and women who are serving so hard right now overseas in Iraq and Afghanistan have what they need in the field, and when they come home, they get the health care that they deserve.
Thank you, Kelly. Ovide, you have 1 minute.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Carolyn. The role of the United States Senate under our Constitution is quite clear, that we provide advice and consent to the President, to the executive branch, to the President, on issues of treaties, on issues of appointment of ambassadors, appointment of judges. Advice and consent, I don't believe, stops because of bills before you. I think advice and consent is an ongoing process. Paul Hodes is a Barack Obama supporter. When the President leaves our shores and goes on foreign soil, he's the head of state. He needs to promote America, not apologize for America. And my advice and consent to the President would be stand up for America, Mr. President. Defend us and promote us when you're abroad. Paul Hodes will stand silently by, and I won't let it happen. And I think we need to have more balance in government and have the right focus. And as a United States Senator, I'll stand with the people and the interests of this country every time and give the advice and consent that you would expect the President to receive.
Thank you, Ovide. Jim, you have 1 minute.
Well, I'm going to assume that Mr. Hodes is following the administration's lead because I've not heard Mr. Hodes disagree with President Obama on anything. In the past 18 months, we've strained our alliances around the world, from Britain to Israel to Japan to South Korea. We also have undermined our strength and the perception of who we are with our enemies. We've done things which undermine our military in performing their operations. First of all, we announced withdrawal dates to our enemies, which is not helpful, either to our objective or to our military in executing those objectives. And to announce that there are certain classifications of weapons that you will never use, such as nuclear weapons, even if you don't intend to ever use them, undermines the concept of deterrence. So our current leadership has been dismal, both with respect to our relations with our allies as well as the management of our adversaries.
Thank you, Jim. Bill, you have the last response for 1 minute.
A strong defense is the first and primary responsibility of the federal government, number one. Number two, Congressman Hodes and President Obama, in my opinion, have failed on that level. They haven't secured our borders, number one. Number two, President Obama has went around the country and around this world apologizing for the behavior of our country. That's abominable. And number three, they don't understand the very simple concept that there are people in this world that don't like us because we are free and democratic and that they want to do us harm. I've learned in my life that you can't get along with everybody. I've learned in my life that some people just don't like you for whatever reason. And whether you want to understand them or not, or have them like you or not, is irrelevant to the fact that you must protect yourself and your family. The people in Washington right now in the current administration, of which I put Mr. Hodes and President Obama, don't get that basic fact of human behavior. We need to stand up to Iran and make sure they don't get a nuclear weapon. We need to make sure that our military is funded completely. We need to bring both of these wars in Afghanistan and Iraq to a successful and complete conclusion. And that's where I would differ dramatically with Mr. Hodes. I don't think he understands those basic tenets and points. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Well, now moving into closing statements. Each candidate has 2 minutes for their closing statements, and we will go in reverse order from the beginning. So, Ovide, you get to start.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Thank you for being the moderator of the debate, and our panelists, Carolyn and Charlie. I appreciate your participating, and the committee for organizing this. And I want to thank all of you who are here this evening. It's very important to us as candidates to get our message out, to hear from you and to see you, and you will have a chance to talk about this evening's forum afterwards. And I want to thank you for being here. You give us solidarity as candidates. And I want to also thank our fellow candidates and actually Kelly, who's not a fellow candidate in a way. She is a candidate. And we are all here for the same reason. We want to earn your support. We want to be the nominee. I signed yesterday the petition in the Secretary of State's office to be a candidate for United States Senate. When I did that with the full weight of what it meant, that my name would be on the ballot in the primary before you. I ask for your support. I need your vote to be your nominee for United States Senate. And when I did that, I also released Ovide's Oath. It's a statement, a pledge to you as voters, 15-point pledge. We'll have it outside when you leave to take a look at it. I think it's a comprehensive statement of where we need to go as a country and what I would do as a United States Senator, and I ask you to consider that on the merits. In the end, and I know New Hampshire voters pretty well, you make a decision a few days before the primary. You're supporting one of us now, many of you, but things do change, and there will be a lot of change coming up. I ask you to ask yourself the question, who stands as the best candidate to stand up to Paul Hodes on every issue that matters to you? Who presents the starkest contrast? Who's got the record of performance that you can count on? And then I'd ask you to cast a vote for that person who you think will go on to represent us in the general election and in the U.S. Senate. My name is Ovide Lamontagne. I'm not independently wealthy. I'm not the establishment candidate. I am going to be your candidate. I need your help, and I ask you to join our team. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ovide. Kelly, you have 2 minutes for your closing remarks.
I want to thank all of you also for being here tonight. I want to thank my family who's in the front row who are here as well. And I also want to thank each of the candidates that are up here. I think all of you who have seen us here know that every single person on this stage will be a better United States Senator than Paul Hodes this fall. And it's a very exciting election for Republicans. I've had the privilege of serving our state for 5 years as Attorney General. What we need in Washington is leadership, people who are going to get results. And as Attorney General, I led by example. When we had a police officer that was murdered in the line of duty, I went into the courtroom and tried the case myself. When we had our laws challenged in federal court, our parental notification law, I argued the case myself before the United States Supreme Court. When there were pay raises, and we were talking about a budget crisis in our state, and we still are, last January when I was Attorney General, every department head was scheduled to get a 5% pay increase. I turned the pay increase down. And that had nothing to do with running for office. It's just because it was the right thing to do, knowing that we were going to pass it down to taxpayers and knowing that there were going to be layoffs in state government. I have the courage, the conviction, and the leadership record to handle the challenges that we have. And we have significant challenges, and most of all, we need courage. Courage to cut spending in Washington to have a balanced budget. And you could agree or disagree with the decisions I made as Attorney General. But you know that I will roll up my sleeves, I will get it done, and get results for you, and be accountable to you, the people of New Hampshire. Most of all, we need leaders who are going to be accountable and listen to you, and not have the attitude of, I know better than you. I don't. I know that if I have the privilege of being our next United States Senator, it will be to represent you and to get our fiscal house in order, to balance our budget, to cut spending, and to make sure that we don't go the way of Greece, that we remain the greatest country in the world. Because if we don't fix it now, we're not going to fix it, and it's only going to get worse. So let's go forward and fix the challenges that we have in this country and make sure that we don't continue to mortgage our children's future. That's why I'm running. That's why I'm doing this. That's why I gave up my job. That's why we went from 2 to 1 incomes in our middle-class family, which was not an easy decision. But I'll tell you, I feel so passionate about this, and we can get it done together.
Thank you, Kelly. Bill, you have 2 minutes.
First of all, thank you for having me here this evening, the Nashua Republican City Committee. I want to thank you very much for a terrific forum. I want to thank my family for coming this evening and my friends and supporters. The voters of New Hampshire will have a choice, a real choice, about who do they want to go to Washington to solve the real practical problems that we all are facing. Our tax policy is a mess. The debts in the balance sheet of our government is a mess. We have 10% unemployment and China has 10% growth. We have fundamental structural economic issues in our country and debts and deficits that are unsustainable and changing all of our lives. Every one of us has a friend or a neighbor working part-time or making less money today than they did just a year or two ago. Our houses, Lord knows, is worth less today than it was a few years ago, no matter what we do. Things are changing and beyond our control, and the answers lie by reducing the spending in Washington. I've spent 6 months of my life in China, 3 years in Europe. I've lived and worked all over the world, the Middle East, Latin America, South America. I've built over 40 manufacturing facilities around this country and worldwide. I know what it's like to compete globally. I know what the debts and the deficits are because I've worked and done billions of dollars worth of transactions and borrowed that money and paid every single penny back. I've had thousands and thousands of people responsible with their paychecks on my back. I know what it feels like. I know what it's like when your head hits the pillow, wondering on a Thursday night if you have enough money to make the payroll on Friday. That's real responsibility. I think that somebody with that kind of responsibility is real leadership. And it takes that kind of experience to go to Washington to make the tough choices, to make it work for all of us. We need to fix what's wrong with America. I think my life's journey, my life's experience of coming from humble roots, of working my way through college, of building a successful business, of seeing something in the world, competing globally and being successful, of understanding the capital markets and the tax code, is relevant now more than ever. We want to solve our problems. I want to go down for 2 terms. I won't take a pension. I won't take any special health care benefits. I just volunteer. I want the work. I want to make a difference. Thank you. I look forward and ask for your support. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. Jim, you have the final concluding remarks.
Thank you all for being here tonight. If I'm selected to be our next senator, I will promise you that I will exercise good sense, competence, and integrity. And I'll have the mind of a public servant who put your interests above mine at all times, put the interests of America first, and the interests of New Hampshire first. I'll serve with transparency and based on constitutional principles. And I also will think in terms of what is the long-term best interest of New Hampshire and America. One of the problems that we have right now with our governance is that it has become so expensive to run for one of these offices that only the very wealthiest of Americans seem to even have a chance of trying. And most of our congressmen that I've known over the years, and I've known quite a few, spend 200 nights a year looking for money. How exhausting. And as a result, they can't seem to think past the next November election. The greatest country in the history of mankind can't be run by people with such short planning horizons. I think of some of the great leaders in history that I admire, such as Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill, before the Battle of Britain, London was about to get pulverized by the Nazis. And Winston Churchill got on the radio and he summoned the courage of his countrymen. And he said, if the empire should last 1,000 years, let men say that this was our finest hour. Wouldn't it be nice to have leaders who could think about the long-term future of our country instead of being so short-sighted and just so opportunistic that they're motivated by what will get them through the next election? Well, I'm the first to advocate term limits. I think there's nothing we could do that would improve our republic more than limit the amount of time that a congressman could spend in Washington. I've pledged no more than 2 terms. Everyone else has followed me in that pledge, and I will fight for it. I'm just not going to abide by it. I'm going to fight for it. I think this is essential to improving our democracy. And when you think about Senator Gregg, his best year has been his last year, when he's been unencumbered by having to run for re-election. So I think that's a lesson, and thank you very much for your time tonight.
Thank you, Jim. Can we give all 4 of them a round of applause? Jim, Bill, Kelly, Ovide, thank you all 4 for putting your names on the line, your capital on the line, and the hard sweat and tears and the equity that goes into this. I know what it takes, so thank you from all of us for taking the time to put your name on this ballot and run to represent the state of New Hampshire. I'd like to thank Charlie and Carolyn, our 2 panelists this evening. Thank you for joining me here tonight. And finally, Ed and Dennis, thank you for organizing the event this evening as well. I have just a couple of quick announcements I'd like to make on behalf of the City Committee. They asked me to make sure everyone is aware of a few things. First, this event tonight will be aired on WYCN, Carolyn's TV network, on the following dates. This Saturday, June 12th at 3 p.m. Again, Sunday, June 13th at both 11 a.m., 2 p.m., and then 7 p.m. that evening. And then finally this coming Monday, June 14th at 7 p.m. So you can watch this over and over and over again if you'd like. Also, candidates for the congressional district race in this district, which is number 2, will have a very similar forum to what you saw tonight. That event will take place August 12th. So please mark your calendars if you'd like to see the candidates for this congressional district go through the same process that we went through this evening. Also, Breakfast with Rudy Giuliani is taking place here tomorrow in Nashua at the Crown Plaza. That will be 7:30 a.m. tomorrow morning. That is a fundraiser that Rudy is the host of, and it's a great event for everyone to be at. Again, that's at the Crown Plaza tomorrow morning, 7:30 a.m. And then finally, on the state Senate level side, we have a meet and greet taking place June 17th for Gary Lambert. Gary is a Republican who has recently filed for the state Senate race against Betty Lasky here in Nashua. That'll be on June 17th, 5:30 p.m. at 34 Broad Street. And that is a free reception to get to know Gary. With that, I want to thank the entire audience for sitting through this event in an air-conditioned room. I know it's been a warm one in here, but I appreciate your patience, and I hope you all got a lot out of this as I did. Thank you for your time tonight. Everyone have a great evening. Oh.